This is the Camp Chase Cemetery. Walking among the thousands of graves there is a stark reminder of the cost of the American Civil War. Far from the dramatic volleys of rifle fire and the gallant charges of cavalry that we think of when we think of war, most of these graves are filled with men who died of disease. It isn't exactly a well-kept secret that the Civil War had more deaths due to disease than it did due to battle. But those deaths weren't in vain. In fact, they helped correspond to a relative revolution in medical science that we still feel the effects of to this day. But to fully understand these reforms, first we have to go back to when Camp Chase Confederate Memorial Cemetery was simply known as Camp Chase. Following the cessation and almost complete abolition of the prisoner exchange between the Union and Confederacy in August of 1863, and its almost complete abolition by Ulysses S. Grant in 1864, many camps, such as Camp Chase in Columbus, Ohio, a recruitment and mustering camp formerly, became relatively known as prisoner camps, and began to house more and more prisoners of war as the war continued to drag on. These prisoners often ended up being unfortunately subject to malnutrition and rampant disease outbreaks, such as the smallpox outbreak in Camp Chase from 1863 to 1864 that ended up killing several hundred of the camp's inhabitants, both Union and Confederate, recruit and prisoner. However, such tragedies didn't go unnoticed, and such figures as William A. Hammond, appointed the Surgeon General of the Federal Army at the time, took steps to try and ensure that such tragedies would not reoccur. Even before his appointment as the military Surgeon General, there were several reforms already being undertaken, such as the commission of the Handbook for the Military Surgeon by Robert Clark & Co., published in 1861. This critical document was one of the first to outline the recommended number of medical personnel per military armament, and one of the first to recommend general sterilization, airspace in pavilion-style military hospitals, and a general decorum to military surgical procedures to try and ensure the general livelihood of those being operated upon. Quote, "To the neglect of plain hygienic principles, I am persuaded, is to be attributed the greater portion of diseases that scourge so constantly all armies of the field. Pure air, good, sufficient clothing, good, sufficient, and well-cooked food, temperance and cleanliness are the important points. Soldiers in campaign will always have exercise enough." These points were being made even as Louis Pasteur was discovering and trying to innovate in his germ theory in the same year. William A. Hammond, once appointed to the Surgeon General position, ended up making such crucial innovations as banning mercury from its use, specifically the mercury compound calomel from army supplies. He argued that it was not worthwhile to make an already debilitated patient vomit, even though he was also critical to such reforms as instituting the Army Pavilion Hospital and instituting the first ambulance corps. It was his stance against mercury that ironically ended up having him eventually put on leave and later court-martialed and dismissed in 1864. Dorothea Dix, another famous reformer, also found herself consistently at odds with the Federal Army. Though she's most known for her work in reforming psychiatric care, Dorothea was also appointed the head of one of the very first nurses' corps. And in her time there, she constantly found herself at odds with doctors who would rather women be left out of the operating rooms. However, her persistence and her often even-handedness in dealing with patients of both the Union and the Confederacy likely saved thousands of lives over the course of the war. In fact, one of the most famous battles of the war, the Battle of Gettysburg, left behind over 5,000 wounded soldiers, both Union and Confederate, many of whom ended up being treated by Dix's nurses. One Union nurse, Cornelia Hancock, wrote about the experience, quote, "There are no words in the English language to express the suffering I witnessed today." Those words would, very critically, be found, though. Even after the war, the Union doctors that served and saw the atrocities of it both in disease and in battle wounds, came together to write the Medical and Surgical Histories of the War of the Rebellion, published by the Washington Government Printing Office and published through 1870 to 1888 in several volumes and chapters. This book cataloged several accounts and several eyewitness reports of the various ways that wounds and treatments had been evolving throughout the war, and it's something that was critically important to the rapidly developing history of medicine at the time. The expedient responses of the officials in the Union Army, even in the face of the opposition, and the developments spawned from the war likely saved hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives in the years to come, and it was the beginning of a medical revolution that would continue to be expounded upon in World War I and would lead into the relative medical security and advancement that we have today.